Hello, everyone. My guest today is Marc van Meel, manager for responsible AI at KPMG Netherlands, proponent of responsible AI and ethics expert, and keynote speakers at various events. Hello, Marc, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for the very generous introduction, and thank you for having me. Very happy to be here and talk to you.
So maybe let's start with an open question, which is a bit repeatable these days. But let's say, what are the key risks of AI? And maybe restricted more to business than to AI in general.
No, sure. Good question. I think AI creates various novel new risks, essentially, right? So if we compare artificial intelligence, let's say, and with artificial intelligence, I mean, let's limit the scope to like the latest fashionable AI systems. So these neural networks, these ChatGPT-like systems. Let's take that as a scope. They create fundamental different risks as opposed to traditional IT systems, right? IT systems already create risks. That's why, for instance, we have IT auditors, frameworks with respect to IT systems to keep those in check. If you look at AI, these systems operate in a fundamental different way, in a sense that they often leverage applied statistics, of what we call machine learning. And these systems therefore come with an inherent, I would say, notion of unpredictability, right? Because these systems, they leverage statistics. They are what we call probabilistic by nature. They figure things out themselves on their own by leveraging statistics. They are not predetermined. They are not deterministic, as traditional IT systems often are. They're fully programmed by us. So we can fully specify and account for every scenario we want or do not want to happen. Because these systems, they figure out solutions by themselves. They are inherently unpredictable. And it makes it very challenging for frameworks, for IT auditors to, like, let's say, a priori account for everything that could go wrong. So this is something which we also call underspecification. So if I got a traditional problem, a traditional IT system, it's very easy for me as a programmer to specify every possible outcome, every scenario to account for. And because these AI systems, they figure things out themselves, they leverage statistics, they look at historical data. They're often applied for problems which we cannot determine ourselves because they're either too complex or unfeasible for us to do ourselves. There's always this notion of unpredictability associated with these systems, and therefore things can and are going wrong in practice. They're often failures or scenarios which we didn't account for a priori, and then we figure them out when it's too late. That, I would say, in a nutshell, is the essence of many risks associated with AI systems.
Is, let's say, explainable AI achievable at all? Because like the father of deep neural networks, Geoffrey Hinton, said that we don't know what's in the black box, and we may never get to know it exactly.
Yeah, no, I think he had a point. If you look, for instance, at these at the most complex, sophisticated systems, AI systems which we currently have, which are indeed neural networks, as systems like ChatGPT, for instance, they leverage neural networks. We apply these systems for the most complex problems which we encounter. So, for instance, it seems like a trivial task, determining whether or not this picture of a dog, for instance, is a dog, or whether or not is a cat, for instance. To us, it's rather simple, but it's actually, in essence, a very complex problem. Because, for instance, if I ask you to specify to an alien life force, for instance, what actually constitutes a dog, or what are the features that differentiate dogs from cats, or mammals from non-mammals, for instance, it's actually very difficult to do. It requires an almost endless list of statements, of specifications as to why a dog is actually a dog, right? So this is why we have these neural networks, which are, in essence, we're kind of brute forcing them. Actually, we're feeding them tons and tons, thousands, maybe even millions of historical instances of images of dogs. for the system to then automatically, by means of statistics, arrive at some, well, you could call it a formula or a function that then determines, whether or not an image is a dog, for instance. But this is actually a very complex problem. So it's not weird that we apply these complex systems to complex problems, and therefore they are inherently unexplainable, right? Because if we could explain them, we wouldn't need these neural networks, right? If the problem was as simple or explainable, we wouldn't need to resort to the most technological, sophisticated, or inherently complex, unexplainable methods, right? We wouldn't need them. So I often encounter people who have I would almost say a love for explainability as this end-all solution. I'm a bit more skeptical in the sense that I often think that asking whether or how a certain neural network, for instance, arrives at its conclusion, often it's a nonsensical question. Because if we knew this, we wouldn't need the system in the first place. I think Professor Floridi once gave a very nice example. He said that asking an explanation from a neural network is as useful as asking how the state of traffic in Amsterdam is the way it is at a given moment, right? Yeah, it might be interesting to know, but there are so many factors, so many variables to account for that in essence, it becomes a nonsensical question, right?
That may change.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very difficult to fully describe all the factors, all the variables that led to the state of traffic of Amsterdam at a given moment. Very difficult to do. What maybe is way more interesting is to look at what we can do with this information, right? Which is essentially data science. It's applied statistics. It's not necessarily a science. It's more leveraging data to gain insights that are actionable.
You work with large enterprises. Isn't it the case that large enterprises in general are afraid to apply AI because it's not explainable, and this creates, legal liabilities that may not be truly understandable and truly describable today?
There are companies indeed who are like that, or who look at technology like that. I have to say this differs vastly. This is all based on I would call it the risk appetite of an organization. So the willingness to which an organization is willing to go with respect to accepting risks. You can never fully prevent or mitigate all risks, of course, but some organizations are a bit more risk adverse than others. There are organizations that like they prefer things not to go wrong, essentially, right? Maybe they have a social responsibility towards citizens or whatever, could be the case. For them, it's way more important not to make negative headlines. There are also organizations, they are more geared towards innovation, for instance. So they're willing to accept bigger risks, a higher degree of risk, in favor of innovation, of going fast, essentially. So this completely depends on the type of organization, also the industry in which these organizations operate, right? So for instance, banking, financial sector is a heavily regulated industry, right? It's maybe not an industry you want to take a lot of liberties or technological adventures, right? While in other domains, maybe a tech domain, organizations are willing to invest more in innovation. So it really differs based on the organization and the sector. Yes.
So what should we do with it? I read an excellent book that I recommend to everyone. Probably the best book on digital transformation I've read in the last 2 years. Mustafa Suleyman, creator of DeepMind, titles The Coming Wave. And what Mustafa Suleyman proposes is to contain. He uses the word containment so that the business and also the public contain themselves from applying AI full scale. Would you agree with that viewpoint?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't read his book. I'm missing out on something apparently. What does this concept of containment exactly?
So containment, something like this relates to the word containment used in the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union, where the two parties possessed nuclear weapons and possessed huge scientific capabilities to invent new mass destruction weapons, but both were containing themselves from using them and also from researching further.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting take on it.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I have to notice the comparison between nuclear technology and AI technology is often made, right? It's an interesting comparison. I do agree with it to some degree, in the sense that they're both very powerful technologies, which can both be used for good things and bad things, right? And I think there are various reasons to be worried about AI technology. In the same way, you can be worried about nuclear technology, right? So, for instance, you can be worried about the impact on the environment, for instance. And nuclear technology creates nuclear waste. Well, it's not good for the environment, of course. So, what to do with that? In the same way, you can be worried about AI technology, for instance, the ecological footprint these large models in the cloud create. You can be worried, for instance, about safety, right? So, you can use AI for nefarious purposes. You don't want your self-driving cars to go wrong, or killer robots, autonomous weapon systems is maybe not a good idea. In the same way, you can be worried about nuclear technology being applied for for things like nuclear bombs. So I get the comparison. With respect to containment, well, at least I'm not seeing that in practice, right? So, for instance, I believe OpenAI, but also Elon Musk, I think it's a sales trick. They first argue, oh, our technology is so powerful. It might even be an existential threat to humanity. So everybody is geared up. And then a couple months later, they release the technology, right? So it's a very effective sales tactic, I would argue, to maybe overestimate your technology and then release it in the wild. At least that's my observation.
Do you see changing pattern over last month, this year, since the outburst of ChatGPT, that companies are more open to apply AI? Because there was a lot of talk, at least in Europe, about, let's say, for the last 2 years or so, we have to apply AI or machine learning into automation processes. Many have been talking, few have been doing it, really. This is my perception. Has it changed finally, or is it changing?
Yeah, I think so. So things usually come in waves, right? So by the way, maybe I don't think I fully answered your previous question. Maybe we can get to it later. I mean, if you're talking about containment and existential risk, I'm aware people like Sam Harris, Elon Musk, they make pretty convincing points or arguments, very logical. They're very convincing, rational actors. People like Bostrom as well, with respect to the potential outfall of science, applied sciences, like AI. I get those arguments. I don't think AI, artificial intelligence, at the moment is in a stage in which it actually poses an existential threat, right? So maybe also to
I
answer
agree.
your second question, with respect to ChatGPT, indeed it was sold as this pretty impressive technology, and to a degree it is, but in essence it's just a chatbot on steroids, right? And you can actually see the hype cooling down a little bit. I think we're already post hype at the moment, right? So in the beginning it's always big and happening. People didn't expect a certain technology to arrive. I believe the AI Act also wasn't prepared at all for the rise of large language models, for instance. Not much mention of those. ChatGPT kind of turned the whole AI landscape upside down. Everybody was talking about it. Now I think you can already see the hype cooling down a little bit, in the sense that people realize, okay, what this technology actually is, what it can do, what it can't do, the limitations. And you can, of course, already see the first responsible usage popping up, right? Guidelines, ethical frameworks, policies as to how to apply this technology in a responsible fashion. So there are companies, for instance, who limited it, who banned it completely, and they're now starting to relax the usage of this technology. Because they also realize that completely banning it, completely blocking it, is hindering innovation. And I think most companies nowadays are AI companies, or sorry, I should say IT companies, who will be AI companies in the near future, because I believe the majority of IT systems will be AI infused in the near future. So if they're smart, they've realized, okay, let's look for ways to apply this technology in a responsible fashion instead of completely banning it all right out.
How to implement AI responsibly? Let's say your general view on the topic as well, if you could, probably, if it's of course possible, to share some cases from your practice, of course, without individual names or anything.
Yeah, now we're getting to the meat of the sandwich,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
A very good question. No, indeed. So again, so if you look at traditional IT systems, traditional technologies, they, for instance, they're already being audited by IT auditors, right? So if you have a financial system, for instance, or an IT system that touches upon financial statements, for instance, these systems are usually heavily regulated. They need to be audited. There are various frameworks, quality standards, best practices available in the world, for instance, set up by ISO standards, qualifications with respect to building software. All of this is readily available. I know the healthcare sector, for instance, has a very rich also ethical tradition with respect to ethical issues within that domain. All of these things you can leverage from, right? So data science is a relatively new domain. Data science, I mean the field that produces these AI systems, that researches them, creates them, develops them, deploys them. We don't have to start from scratch. So the various disciplines we can leverage to enable trustworthy, responsible, ethical adoption, development of these systems, luckily for us. So the fundamental difference is in the risks themselves, which we already touched upon in the beginning. There are a lot of people who have knowledge about IT systems, about the risks of IT systems. There are not so many people around who have inherent knowledge about the risks of AI systems, or who are very familiar with the ethics of artificial intelligence, for instance. So again, ethics is not new. AI itself as a technology is also not very new. It's already been around since at least the 60s.
70 years, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So what we need is people who have knowledge about all of these domains, or at least have teams that have cross knowledge about these domains, and bring those together to safeguard and also implement the ethical, responsible adoption of these technologies. So I can name some examples, if you would allow me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for instance, for the city of Amsterdam, we as KPMG, we've assisted the city of Amsterdam with designing a control framework, for instance. A control framework is something that is not new for people with audit experience, for instance. It's essentially a framework that lists certain risks, things that could go wrong with the system, and also mitigating measures, or measures that can prevent certain risks. So if you follow those, there's of course less chance of things going wrong. This is something we assisted the municipality of Amsterdam with their algorithms. You have to imagine the city of Amsterdam is a very smart city,
Yes,
together with cities like New York and Singapore. They're very much out there. So we help them with designing a control framework. We're also assisting other organizations with, for instance, setting up an ethical framework. Again, this is also not necessarily new. Organizations typically already have like business ethics or certain values they aspire to, adhere to. You can do the exact same, but then with respect to AI, right? So for instance, what are some of the AI applications we do or maybe do not want to develop or deploy as a company, as an organization, right? these are very important questions to address, and they actually help in practice. So, for instance, an ethical framework is a very good way of enabling employees of an organization to check whether or not what they're working on, what they're developing, deploying is actually what they as a collective would like to do, right? So, and the reasoning I'm mentioning this is because if you would allow me to highlight one fundamental difference with traditional IT systems, is that systems like ChatGPT, for instance, the success is in the accessibility. So these systems are available to us just by one browser click away, essentially, right? And this is very interesting because I used to be a data scientist myself. Maybe like 5 years ago, I had exclusive access to these technologies, to the most powerful neural networks. The technical listeners would recognize this as maybe recurrent neural networks or LSTMs. They were usually the exclusive domain of data scientists, even though they were open source, only we knew what to do with them. Nowadays, you, I, my mother, my near family, everybody has access to the most powerful neural networks essentially ever created, right? So what this means in practice is that it's very, very difficult for organizations to limit the usage of these technologies, right? Where in the past, organizations could resort to access rights, for instance, right? Or account management or software licenses, right? It was very easy based on what you would do as an organization or your position in the organization, limit your access to certain applications. Nowadays, that's unfeasible, right? Because you can just open ChatGPT in your browser. And if I, as an organization, ban ChatGPT in my domain, for instance, you can just use it on your personal device, right? Which maybe is even worse because you're going to copy personal or sensitive information from your personal device to your work device, right? So banning it is a bad strategy. Now, why am I telling you this? I believe it was Lenin who once said, trust is nice, control is better. I think nowadays we find ourselves in the opposite scenario, right? Yeah, it would be nice if you can control what your employees are doing with certain software applications, but it might be, exactly, it might be an illusion to think that you can actually control them. So maybe trust is better. Maybe it's better to educate, to make employees aware of how to use these systems in a responsible way, in a responsible fashion, than to try to limit the usage, which is unfeasible in practice. And this is, for instance, something where an ethical framework comes into the spotlight, that you give guidance to employees as to what do we want to use these systems for and what not.
This is a very, very good point, very, very deep one. I've read recently about, let's say, 3 approaches to regulating AI. The US one, which is market-driven. Let's not interfere where we don't need to. The Chinese one, which is state-driven. And the European one, which is rights-driven. So let's say we regulate with a citizen in the center and his rights. I'm afraid that the European approach would not be as powerful and would not break through as much as the other two, though I would love it to happen.
If I might respond to that, you have to give the Chinese credit, I feel, in the sense in the at the pace in which they set up their regulations, for instance. I believe they were published a couple months ago, if I'm not mistaken. So they're way faster than the European Union, at least, with respect to coming up with rules. I read there basically the Chinese version of the European AI Act. I read it. I thought it was quite interesting. I think that they made there were some really good points in there as well. Points we would agree with from our cultural perspective, I feel. I believe the first rule was that you cannot create, develop, deploy systems that go against the party, or the values of the Chinese party, if I'm not mistaken, or something along those lines, or the values of the socialist values. Well, that's where I felt it gets a bit iffy, right? Because who wants to be the arbiter of that? Well, that's of course the Chinese state in that sense. So I get your point. Also with respect to the Americans, right? So indeed, they're more market driven. There's this meme of regulation kills innovation, right? And I think that's where a lot of people in Europe are afraid of. Now, I agree to this to a certain extent. What I do have to give Europe, and also the European Commission, and also the people who draft the AI Act credit for, is that, for instance, the AI Act is fundamentally risk-based, right? So it's not as black and white as people sometimes make it out to be. Oh, you're not allowed this, you're not allowed that. The AI Act is risk-based. So, for instance, they don't necessarily look at the specific technology involved. They look at the usage or the domain in which this technology is applied. So they're kind of abstracting from, whether or not you use queries or whether or not you're using regression or whether or not you're using neural networks. That's not that interesting. It's of course tied to the mitigation measures you have to take, but that's maybe a discussion for later. But I do have to give them credit for using a risk-based approach, which in my estimation is the right approach to look at these systems, right? Don't make the mistake of zooming in too much at purely the technological system, because this algorithm or this model is always integrated in a software solution, in an IT system, which is then, of course, always part of this decision-making chain, right? So this system is used in combination with, for instance, human actors, upstream or downstream, or maybe the system interchanges or acts together with other systems. There's an interplay, a dynamic of multiple systems, multiple models, which all leads to a certain outcome, for instance, right? So it's much more useful, I feel, to look at the potential risks, at the potential fallout and the probability of things going wrong at a bit more abstract level. So a level higher, at least, than purely the system itself. And maybe to add on that very briefly, if you look at Europe, most Western countries our law is actually also based on that, right? So our law is not necessarily it's also, you could say, it's use case based, right? So if you have a good reason as to why you did something, the fine could be less, so to speak. It's not as black and white as people make it out to be. There can be various mitigating circumstances or reasons or motivations as to why you did something that could make the fine less, right? Or maybe even determine it wasn't your fault at all, or you had no choice as to act in a certain way, right? So I do have to give Europe credit for that.
Will we have chief AI officers in companies at board level in the near future?
Let me say two things. This is a bit connected, but to add upon your previous question, what I am worried about, and I'll get to the chief in a moment, is how to enforce this, right? So in theory, it all sounds good, AI Act, blah, blah, blah. And maybe if you're a large company, maybe you're a large enterprise or big tech company, all of this is doable. It's doable to adhere to the regulations and requirements as stated in the AI Act, Digital Service Act, Digital Markets Act, for instance, all these various regulations that are coming to us in the same fashion as, for instance, the GDPR. However, if you're a small to mid-sized company, maybe you're an AI company or maybe you're developing AI systems, I'm a bit worried about the amount of requirements that you're being faced with. And indeed, who's going to be responsible for this? I believe a chief data officer is, I think most companies now have a chief data officer, right? Or at least a lot of them have, which is a relatively new C function, if you look at it historically. I think it's definitely not unthinkable to, in the near future, have a chief AI officer, for instance, right? Maybe together with a CIO, a CDO. I think this is not unthinkable. Because again, right, sometimes I talk to organizations who question whether or not they are actually an IT organization. And I always tell them, well,
most organizations are.
yeah, you better believe you are already an IT organization, right? So if you look at the vast amounts of IT systems you're probably leveraging, or some people argue, we don't make data-driven decisions. We don't use data. I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't be so sure of that, right? Even if you are working with purely Excel systems, Excel is not a database, right? Or maybe if you're only using Excel, you're also making data-driven decisions, right? You're not acting in a random manner. At least I hope not. So you're already an IT company. And in the near future, you will also be an AI company. So you better prepare, you better anticipate for these changes, and you better adopt to these changes as soon as possible. And you don't have to be the next Google, but 100% you will be an AI infused company in the near future. And if you're not, maybe you don't want to, your competitor will be, right? And yeah, let's see what happens to your company then.
Would you advise some tips on how to implement AI from very practical level? Shall we mount a separate team for that, or should it be, let's say, so to say, an AI person in every department, like marketing, like sales, like HR, working along, the domain people, and translating this to them, and let's say how a good chief AI officer should coordinate it, so to build trust.
Yeah, I can give some practical advice. You can hire us, of course, but no, really, my practical advice would be to start small. So let's say you have a decent sized organization. Maybe you're already entertaining the idea of applying AI. Maybe you don't really know where yet. Oh, you read something about ChatGPT. Oh, that's interesting, right? My advice would always be to start small. So most likely, one or two persons within your organization are already advocates or experts on a certain topic, right? Probably within your organization, if it's large or mid-size or maybe even small, I'm pretty confident that in most organizations, there's this one person walking around who has actually a lot of knowledge about AI. Maybe he or she built their own language model, I don't know, or he or she has some very good idea about use cases. Empower this individual to educate other users, other employees within your organization. Maybe just start with a knowledge sharing session or something. You don't have to make it too big yet in the beginning, but for sure. And also within larger organizations, there are always departments who are more tech savvy than others, right? For instance, if you look at in the medical domain, at hospitals, for instance, the radiology department is typically very tech savvy, right? They've already been applying neural networks for ages, right? These neural networks that make scans, for instance, of people's bodies and automatically determine deviations, for instance, on pictures. These are neural networks. They've already been applying those for years, right? So for sure they are tech savvy. Find ways to empower those people. Maybe you can enable them to take the lead, for instance, right? And it doesn't have to be a full-blown digital transformation, but maybe first see, okay, let's investigate what's going on here. What are these new technologies? How can we leverage those? What can these technologies do and cannot do? Maybe you can educate your fellow employees, your colleagues on how to work smarter, how to work more efficient. What are CRTs? These are what I like to call cognitive repetitive tasks, right? So these are tasks that are easy, prone to automatization, right? Maybe the creation of PowerPoints or generating vast amounts of texts, right? Why would you still need to do this manually if it can be AI assisted, right? And then try to search for ways to do this in a responsible way, right? So uploading, again, personal sensitive company information into a public version of ChatGPT, for instance, maybe not the best way to go. But maybe there's an alternative, right? Maybe you can use a local instance. see if you can put this use case forward with whoever is responsible within your organization for IT resources, for the IT ecosystem, maybe. So try to get this issue on the agenda within the organization. So I feel, again, use cases, they kind of have to come up from they have to be bottom up with respect to recognizing the importance, developing an AI strategy, etc., aligning AI with the goals of the company. I feel this has to come from the top of the organization.
Right. The last question on my part, and a quite technical one, or maybe not that technical. I'm very curious of your opinion, because I see two camps. One is that companies will build their own infrastructure for implementing AI, like similar to the cloud when it started, that everybody was building a private cloud. The other camp is that there won't be building own infrastructures. Everybody will rely on this large language models and their infrastructure as what they have built in terms of privacy, of data ownership, is already way more advanced than in the case of cloud revolution. What would be your take?
It's a very interesting question. Again, yeah, maybe it's not the answer you would like to hear, but again, it fully depends on the company and the domain you're working in, because indeed, right, there could be various reasons as to why you would like to have things more local, or be able to customize things your own, set up your own infrastructure, but there can also be very good reasons as to why you do not want to do this, right? So, for instance, myself, I've been playing around with creating my own large language models, for instance. So you can basically take a GPT instance from the web and then customize it, tailor it for your own needs. Now, for instance, this could be very useful if you do not, under any circumstances, want your company information to leave or spread on the internet, for instance, right? So if your information is very sensitive, and there should be absolutely no way that this information can leak to the outside or can be accessible for third parties. Maybe this is something you can leverage, right? On the other hand, my personal results are that these localized versions are not so, they might be good at a certain task, but generally they tend to underperform. So if I have my own GPT running, which I fine-tuned for something, it's all right, but it's not as good as ChatGPT-4, for instance. So I'm getting better results across the board with the cloud version, right? Which maybe shouldn't come to a surprise. Also, if you are a smaller company, right? Maybe it's not feasible to set up your own infrastructure. Another reason could be, so I already touched upon the resources it will take for companies, for instance, to be compliant, right? And to do proper data management, for instance. Well, you could essentially outsource this problem, right? So if you're, for instance, leveraging Azure or you're using Microsoft for their AI models or their databases, their cloud infrastructure, as long as Microsoft is compliant, you're compliant, right? So you could essentially, and going a bit quick here, but you could essentially outsource your entire data management to Microsoft, right? As long as they're compliant, you're compliant. So that saves you a lot of time, saves you a lot of resources. But again, there could be various reasons as to why you would not like to put your information with Amazon or Microsoft or Google. Maybe it will be an interplay, right? Maybe in the near future, we will have these, I'm limiting the scope to language models here. But of course, this also applies to images or other domains. Maybe you can have a localized system, right? That is able to answer questions you have with respect to company data, HR-related questions. And maybe for other tasks, you're leveraging the models provided by Microsoft or by Google. Could be. I think it will be an interplay of these systems, whether or not they're cloud-based or localized. I do see a lot of opportunities for B2B though, because a lot of these applications we've been discussing as well, they're essentially B2C. So I can use ChatGPT in my work, you can use it, that's nice. But what would be applications of, for instance, large language models or other sophisticated neural networks that we can apply in a B2B fashion? I think that would also be a very interesting domain for the years to come for organizations. So yeah, it's of course nice you can accommodate your employees or your consumers, but how can you leverage this for B2B purposes? I think this is a little bit, this domain is a little bit in the shadows.
I see a huge market opportunity.
You do?
B2B. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I fully agree. Either way, it will be very interesting. I think we live in very interesting times with respect to AI. And again, if I might add, I don't think organizations need to radically change their business models, right? So the fact that you now have all these tools available to you, it doesn't mean you need to do or start doing all of these things yourself. Again, I believe companies might be even more specialized or even better at their core tasks or their core business model by leveraging AI, right? If you're a marketing company, leveraging AI will make you a better marketing company, right?
Fully agree.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't need to start doing other tasks, or you don't have to become a supermarket, for instance, right? Yeah, an AI-driven supermarket will be an even better supermarket, but yeah, stick to your own discipline. The fact that you now have ChatGPT available to you, yeah, be careful. Try not to be this jack of all trades, master of none. Let's stick to your core task. I believe that will make you even more competitive.
Exactly. Mark, thank you very much for this conversation. It was great, because it's often that, let's say, people talk about AI ethics in abstract, and I think our conversation was very much not in abstract, but let's say was digging with meat, so to say. And I hope to meet again sometime in the future. Marc van Meel, KPMG Netherlands, was our guest.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to Sherpa Search on Tech. If you have enjoyed the show, please subscribe to our show wherever you listen. Thanks again. The Sherpa Search on Tech podcast is a production of Sherpa Search, an executive search firm specializing in the tech industry, helping hire the right people for expert and managerial positions, and advising how to build and develop long-lasting, high-performing IT teams. If you would like to learn more, reach out to us at maciej.szczerba@sherpasearch.tech or visit our website sherpasearch.tech. See you next time.